what I'd like to do then is to start by asking you to give us like a 3 to 4 minute sketch of how it is that you've come to the perspective that you have, which I think is really interesting for people to understand. Like, why do you care about it? How does a person in your position with your strategic view of money and stuff like that, how do you come to focus on children?
Sure. A lot of my work over the last dozen years has raised questions related to economic development, and not just economic development internationally, but economic development nationally and locally. Cities and states, almost every city and state has some sort of an economic development program. And the problem within the United States is much of the way we promote economic development is counterproductive. And this is work that I've been involved with for, like I said, about 12 years, arguing that we allow cities and states to bid against each other. We dubbed it the economic bidding war, trying to lure each other, sports teams, automobile factories. We argue that's counterproductive. We actually argue it's a zero-sum game from a national perspective. No jobs really are being created. You're just taking jobs away from your neighboring city, your neighboring state. And so from an economic point of view, for many years, we've tried to make this case that we have to rethink economic development in this country. From a legal point of view, it also violates our Commerce Clause. And we had a court decision back on September the 6th, 2004, a U.S. Court of Appeals ruled, consistent with us, that a subsidy that went to Chrysler Corporation to keep them in Toledo, Ohio, to prevent them from moving to, or encourage them to stay instead of moving to Detroit, was unconstitutional. So we think there's good economic and legal arguments for questioning the conventional way we promote economic development in this country, and we're talking billions of dollars across the country. So up until a couple of years ago, when people would ask me if the bidding war is the wrong way, if giving subsidies to specific companies to lure them to your city, to your state, is the wrong way to do economic development, what should a mayor, what should a governor do to promote their economies today and into the future? Knee-jerk reaction up until about 2 years ago would have been to put your money into education. We know high-quality workforce, long-term, short-term and long-term, creates economic growth. It is the way to attract good companies if you have high-quality workers. High-quality workers, educated workers, tend to create their own businesses. You get this synergy there. So while there's no magic bullet to economic development, research pretty much confirms that a key ingredient is the quality of the workforce. And by that I mean human capital, education. And I would have said up until 2 years ago, it would start in kindergarten and go through college, advanced degrees, etc. A couple of years ago, I was asked to, I was actually listening to a report on the importance of investing in birth to 5, which I had never thought about. I looked at the report, and they made the moral argument for doing it, and I was kind of critical of that report. I said, I have a hunch there's a good economic argument that could be made. Well, that was my mistake, because once I made that comment, this advocacy group asked me to come on the board and asked me to write that essay. And a co-author and I, we just went out and looked at the literature on interventions with high-quality programs, with at-risk children in particular. We started to study the brain development research, a totally independent line of research. And they all came together that said, look, if done right, high quality, parent involvement, working with kids birth to 5, you can make an extraordinary difference down the road. We actually went and calculated a rate of return, which nobody had quite done before, that if invested and invested well, what's the return to the public? What's the overall return? We found that annual rate of return from this one study, and there's 4 studies all pointing in the same direction, of 16% inflation adjusted. 12% of that was a public return, because the student is less likely to need special ed, is less likely to be retained in the first grade, is more likely to get a job, stay off of welfare, pay taxes, and the crime rate goes down significantly. So there's some extraordinary public benefits here. So your original question is, how did I get involved? It is kind of through the back door, looking at economic development and realizing most of the economic development that we're funding in this country is counterproductive. There is an area in which we're way underfunding. It's birth to 5, and it should be viewed not just as education, but as economic development.
That's really beautiful. Go ahead and make your adjustment. I'm going to make one little touch up.
Good.
So your study's focused on looking at the same kind of top four that the RAND report that recently came out
Correct.
looked at, right? Implicitly, what we're saying is that it's the how well children are made ready for school. Is that right?
Absolutely. And what we're starting to understand, again, two separate lines of research. One is interventions where we work with the families, work with the child, birth to 5, providing them with high quality teachers and mentors. The other line of research is the brain development itself, how the physical brain develops depending on the environment. And it's all about school readiness. It is, if we do a much better job in getting the child ready for school, that child is going to perform much better. In this state, and I know around the country, we have a problem with an education gap between minority children and white children. We think this is one important way, one critical way of getting at that education gap. If you wait until the child's already in kindergarten, it's too late in many cases. The brain does not develop well if it's not in a normal environment. If it's in a stressful environment, the brain, sort of what brain development people talk about, these windows of opportunity just close up on you. It isn't that the brain can't compensate, but it's never as efficient.
Right, which means that the cost associated with trying to compensate for these variations is, in a practical order, difficult and near impossible to deal with inside school.
It gets very costly inside school. Most of the research says that the child starts out significantly behind. That's a predictor of what they're going to end up in, how they're going to end up in the 3rd grade, the 6th grade, the problems that they're going to end up with. So it's very predictive, and it tells you that we can do something about it. It becomes very costly to try to undo it, so you're much better off investing at the beginning rather than in the middle or at the end.
Talk about, I mean, in some respects, when we talk about these kind of investments, when we talk about these kind of preschools, we're focusing on the comparatively disadvantaged children, the children that are coming out of upper middle class homes where there's a different kind of nourishing environment to stimulate brain growth and so forth. It isn't as necessary there.
That's correct.
So in some
That's
respects,
correct.
how much of what we're saying is that we need to do this in order to compensate for variations in the family? How much about this is
I think most of it is, and it's in the environment. I would talk about in the environment, and it's basically a poverty issue. It isn't that early ed isn't important for every kid, but clearly in middle and upper middle class families, in most cases, not in all, but in high percentage, the environment is a very positive one. Children begin school starting. They're ready for school. They've got the language skills. It's interesting on this topic. I've heard from all over the country from people in the criminal justice department. They tell me they don't put most of, if not all, virtually all in some cases, children that they end up putting into jail don't come from middle and upper middle class families. They come from poverty families. They're well aware of the problem. They see it. They realize that if a kid has a very slow start or if they're far behind in kindergarten, odds are they're going to see him somewhere down the road, 5, 10, 15 years down the road. So they know that. So what we're arguing, and the research kind of shows us, you can get the highest return focusing on the at-risk children. The programs, the ideas are good for all children, of course, and all families. In most cases, middle class and upper middle class families are already doing this. And we're not talking about taking the children in these low-income families out of the family, just the opposite. We're talking about working with the family, because the study shows you've got to get the parent engaged. Essentially, you're educating the parent on parenting, and it's a critical component. And the programs that we are advocating, suggesting to get the high return, includes a mentor with the parent at a very early age. The brain development people will tell you in the most stressful environments, most at-risk children, you have to get them by 3. You can't wait till 4 or 5 even. That can be too late. So we're talking about mentors in families from birth really on. Those kind of programs, they may look expensive. Relatively speaking, they're not, because the return is so high.
Relative to this, notice in California they're moving fast towards establishing a pre-K system, particularly for 4-year-olds. That's what the latest RAND report says in California that was commissioned by the Packard Foundation. That seems to be, I mean, it's a step in the right direction at one level, you might say, but it's also institutionalizing this at a latter stage of the sensitive window. In other words, the information on vocabulary explosions happening late in the second year and then throughout the third year. And that the third year's development of language is critical to everything else.
Yeah, I like the way you said it. Universal 4-year-old early ed is a good first step. I'm not sure it's the best first step, though. The programs that we argue for are focused on at-risk families, birth to 5, with a mentor going to the house, where we actually talk about scholarships for these families. The scholarships are tuition plus. So the plus is the mentor, tuition is when the child turns 3 and 4, then they get to send their child to a high quality early ed program. But it's a more it's a program that covers birth to 5. If you just go at 4-year-olds and if you do it universal, you end up subsidizing a lot of families that don't need it, as we talked about earlier. It's not focused on the real needs because it's starting too late in many cases. So I think universal 4-year-olds is a good step, but I think where the highest return is and where the most need is birth to 5 in the at-risk families. And so you don't simply want to add a grade on to K through 12. And again, I want to empower the parents because the research tells you that if you get the parents engaged, that's the way you're going to get these results. So scholarships for these parents and children so that they get the mentors and they get the opportunity to send their child to a high quality program, I think will be much more successful.
This kind of harkens all the way back to what Coleman was saying in a way, that we're spending all of our money, or we're spending $550 billion, or whatever it is, in the K-12 system, but the thing that's predicting the variation and success in the K-12 system is before the K-12 system, and we're hardly investing in that at all.
Yeah, and it doesn't make any sense. And and I'm not just saying this just because this is my intuition. The research here is pretty convincing, and as I said earlier, it is 2 separate lines of research, independent lines of research. There's the brain development people who now tell you how critical that brain, the architecture is, the development of that architecture is 0 to 5. 0 to 5. And then there's the independent intervention research where they work with at-risk children, providing a high-quality program, comparing them to kids that don't have it, and that research is very, very persuasive.
Have you encountered the Hart-Risley work and Farkas's work on showing that underneath SES really is language?
I have not. I mean, I'm aware of that work, but I haven't studied it. Okay. I know language is a critical part of any early childhood program. Let me give you one case study, I'll call it, that's very consistent with this literature, that profoundly affected the way I think about this. There was a program, not for school readiness, there was a program designed for cultural reasons here in the Native American community to keep the Ojibwe language alive. And so they took groups of very, very young Indian children, 2, 3, and 4-year-olds. They immersed them in the Ojibwe language. And at that age, they're like sponges. They get to kindergarten, and they're the best kids in school by far, and continue to do very well throughout their schooling. It is because this language skill, all right, it transfers to all the other skills. And it made them, what I'll say, some of the most ready kids in kindergarten when they entered. So there's no question language is a key component. There are going to be different ideas, though, and that's fine. The way we envision our programs is we'll let the market figure out what are the best ways to get kids ready. The parents with their mentors will choose the program that fits their needs. My guess, it's going to vary. It's not going to be one size fits all. But the research surely suggests language is going to be a critical component to any successful program.
Excellent. Yes. I think that you'd appreciate the Farkas piece on longs. I mean, he took the whole national database, built it to the attributes, and showed that the auditory processing proficiency of children was actually more predictive of their performance than SES. And this is the same thing that Hart-Risley did from a longitudinal study
I'm not
of small
surprised.
children.
Not surprised.
And it's not
Yeah.
just because language is the bath exercise that's creating brain differentiation at this most fundamental level that's exercising intelligence and all the rest of it, but language is the conveyor of affect. Right? So it's the language environment that's really creating positive or negative affect to such a significant degree. And both of those things are the fundamental cornerstones of literacy, which is the center of success in school.
Et cetera.
Excellent. Let's go back and just, if I can, get a kind of a brief, crisp summary of what you started off with saying relative to the financial fulcrum efficiency of investing in this period. So some kind of sentence length or 2 sentences, whatever you feel would be kind of crisp and in your words. What you talked about was there's all these different strategies for investing and lifting the economy of a particular, city, county, region, whatever, and that there's this great, yet to be fully realized investment strategy, investment logic for investing in children. Nail that.
Conventional economic development is usually focused on what's the next new company we're going to bring here, what new building we're going to put up. It's very visible, it's very concrete. Market does that on its own. Government putting resources into that gets virtually no return. What we don't see, which is much less visible, even though intuitively we kind of know it, is that the quality of our workforce is critical for a strong economy. Most of us don't understand that to get that kind of quality workforce, you got to start at the beginning, birth to 5, investing in birth to 5, which we do very little of in this country. Investing in birth to 5 shows extraordinary returns if it's high quality.
Do you know what like I said before, we got $550 billion, according to the U.S. figures, going through the Department of Ed's figures, going into K-12 a year. Do you have any sense of what we're investing in K-5? Pre-birth 5?
In birth to 5?
K, I'm sorry.
In pre-K, I don't. The big investment, of course, is Head Start.
Yeah.
And Head Start...
like $6 billion or something.
Yeah, and Head Start averages about $6,000, maybe a little bit more than that, per kid per year. About 40% of the kids who are eligible for Head Start, there is no funding. $6,000 per kid, we estimate, based on the studies of high quality early ed, is about 50% to 75% below what it should be to get the kind of quality we need on average. So it's way underfunded from a research perspective. It's well focused, and there are some very good Head Start programs, but on average, they're not getting the returns that we could get if it was well funded and if it was put in a market environment that we're talking about in terms of scholarships and tuition for at-risk parents.
Excellent. It seems to me that what we're talking about, we have this $550 billion investment going into K-12, and the efficiency of that system as a whole really depends on how we reconceptualize investing in this on-ramp into it. And right now, we're talking about like a 1% investment.
Right. Absolutely. This is the work that's coming out of James Heckman at the University of Chicago, where he, I think, makes a very powerful case that we're investing at the wrong end. We should be putting much more at the foundation end in the birth to 5. And percentage-wise, it's minuscule compared to the resources that we put into K through 12. And again, I think it's a rethinking of the importance of birth to 5. I think most of us don't understand how critical those learning years are, how critical those years are to the architecture of the brain, how critical those years are for success in the future. Last 10 years on brain development research, we're just starting to understand how important birth to 5 education is. I think as we educate the public about this, we'll start making some inroads.
Excellent. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you think is a hot button?
You got to the universal versus focused. I like that. The funding. Well, there's like my former governor when Ventura would like to say to me, well, he says, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but that's the job of the mother. And I said my response to him was, I agree with you. Now let's give the mother the tools and the fathers the tools to do this and do it right. The problem is at the middle class and the upper middle class, they have those tools. At the lower end, they don't. And you could say, well, why should I care? You should care because as society, we have to live with huge costs if these kids don't succeed. So there is an attitude out there that this is the job of the parents done. Birth to 5 is not public education. And I think that's something we have to grapple with and explain to people. Yes, it is the job of the parents. The tools that we're talking about are tools we're offering. We're offering opportunities for these parents, the at-risk parents, so they have the same their kids have the same opportunities as the rest of the kids.
Yeah, that would proceed from the assumption that they were aware of the importance.
Right.
And that's precisely what's missing.
That's what's
propagated generation to generation.
Yeah.
That requires some other approach to step in out of the interest in the compassionate well-being of the children, if not in the interests of the economic cost of not doing it.
Right. I mean, you can take the compassionate argument, and that'll work for many people, but I think the economic argument is very important to make, to understand that this is an investment. It's an investment for society, and it's a critical one because it builds.
Okay, well, I'm going to respect our time.
Great.
You've just been an outpour of jewels. Cori, anything that we talked about that we didn't get?
I don't think so, unless there's some in the sentence, and I think you did this well, but just helping reframe it that we can invest in stadiums, we can invest in.
Yeah, that's.
You want me to get?
But where it's just a rework of
Sure.
what you said earlier, where the.
Putting a quick contrast between those scenarios.
Conventional economic development, we think of stadiums, new sports teams, software companies, car companies, trying to attract them here in Minnesota or any other state in the union. We're all trying to do the same game. This is what we think of as conventional economic development. It's counterproductive. It's really a zero-sum game. There's no new jobs that are created in this economic bidding war. We have to rethink economic development. Think of it in a way as the importance of human capital. And when you go down that road and when you start to think about how important worker development, quality of a workforce is, it leads you right away to the foundations, birth to 5. That's where we need to be investing.
Excellent. Just to shorten that piece up then, if you were to say, okay, on one hand I've got investing in stadiums, on the other hand I've got investing in kids. The investing in kids is a better deal.
That's how I usually end my speech here in Minnesota. In Minnesota here, we're talking about two stadiums, one for the Twins and one for the Vikings, the cost of $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion will give me a big enough endowment so that I can ensure that every at-risk child in Minnesota will have a high-quality early ed program. 2 stadiums, high-quality early ed. I don't think there's a real choice here.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Perfect. One of the things that, as we close, get you out of here, is that normally we have people sign a release form. And this morning, in our
Well, you can just send it if you forget.
yeah, we did. So
No problem.
send it to you, and you
Yeah,
can.
you've got
fax it back
the
to me.
information.
I do.
You can email it or whatever works for you. Very nice meeting you. Good luck with
you.
it.
Thank
Yeah.
One of my cards.